Well, welcome to this important webinar discussion on the topic of ethics, education, and good governance for crime prevention and criminal justice, perspectives from faith-based organizations. We're very happy to convene this important discussion as one in a series of webinars that the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations has convened over the past several months during this period of social distancing and lockdown. The coalition was launched in 2019, and we've had a series of meetings, many face-to-face throughout 2019, but for most of 2020, we've been convening by Zoom webinar very productively and very, very happily with many distinguished panelists. Today's discussion is on the role of ethics, education, and good governance in strategies to prevent crime and achieve justice. They're often not considered altogether, but we will try to understand those factors comprehensively this webinar. They build on promoting better individual decisions to ways the educational process can support ethical decision-making, to building capacity and reducing corruption for inclusive and effective governance. The webinar will discuss and highlight the contributions of faith-based organizations in promoting ethics, education, and governance in our efforts to prevent crime and achieve justice more equitably and consistently. We have a very strong group of panelists with us today. I'd like to briefly introduce them to you in the order that they will appear. The first is Dr. J. Albanese. He's Professor of Criminal Justice at Virginia Commonwealth University in the United States. Our second speaker is Dr. Wendy O'Brien, Legal Officer in the Department of Violence Against Children at the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC. Our third panelist is Dr. Elmar Kuhn, Roman Catholic theologian based in Vienna, Austria. And our final panelist is Reverend Darcy Roque, pastor of the Community Church Unitarian Universalist in New Orleans, USA. Also with us is my co-chair for the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations, and that is Dr. Michael Plotzer, longtime career official with the United Nations and happily now committed to the ongoing work of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. He will join us during the discussion portion of the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who in some respects is our keynote panelist. He'll take a little bit longer than the others to kind of lay out the framework, but otherwise panelists have 6 minutes each, and we'll follow up with discussion both among the panelists and questions from the audience. As you know, email your questions, audience members, to coalitionfbo@gmail.com. Also, bios, fuller bios and background on the speakers will appear in the chat column. So you may keep your chat column open to see the fuller bios of our panelists. Without further ado, please welcome, and we give the floor to Professor J. Albanese, Professor of Criminal Justice, Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Albanese.
Thank you very much, Tom. I am very pleased to be here to participate with this distinguished group. And I thought a good place for us to start would be at the very top. And the very top is simply, what are the biggest problems in the entire world? Well, there are a number of expert groups around the world that devote quite a bit of time to considering these issues. On the left, you will see the Copenhagen Consensus, This is a group of experts, and they have come up with a list of what they think are the biggest challenges facing, humankind right now. And then on the right, you will see first the UN Millennium Development Goals. They were developed by the United Nations for 2015, and they were succeeded by the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which guide the UN's work from 2016 to 2030. And you will note there is some, in fact, overlap among these goals. But when you go down the list, you see these have been identified. The UN goals are important because they represent consensus of the UN member states, which comprises pretty much the entire planet. So you see it's poverty, education, gender equality, child health, maternal health, and so on. The Sustainable Development Goals add to these water and sanitation, affordable energy, work, access and equity, justice, and sustainable communities. So when you think about what are the things we should be spending time on, you have, this is pretty much the planetary consensus. Well, we move from there and we say, okay, well, when you look at those problems and I say, what do they have in common? Well, one thing they have in common is the fact that we, that is human beings, either created every one of these problems or we pushed it to a crisis point by our own decisions. And these decisions generally resulted from ignorance, selfishness, or corruption. So the question becomes, none of these world's largest problems are self-generating. These are things that we help to create or push to a crisis point. The point I'm making here is the role of individual decisions in creating global problems cannot be underestimated. So if you will grant me my assumption that individual decisions are the drivers of these global problems, the question becomes, well, where do these individual decisions that happen to be poor ones come from? Well, we often see that the poor decisions come from either self-seeking behavior or corruption itself. So you look here at the box, we always see the manifestations in public life, in corporate life, governments, and so forth. So the question becomes, well, where does this corrupt behavior come from? Well, it comes from corrupt officials, all right? We tend to have people either in positions of public authority, positions of corporate or in the business world, who are either untrustworthy or they're put in positions of authority and they engage in self-seeking or corrupt behavior. Okay, then the question is, well, where in fact do these people come from? Well, it's often said they have opportunity to engage in corruption without proper oversight. So they're poorly supervised, there's low audit risks, there's low odds of apprehension, and that's what causes them to engage in the corrupt behavior. So we all decide, well, if this is the case, let's reduce the opportunities for corrupt behavior and increase the oversight. And this leads us to the most common remedy we see around the planet. And the remedies that we seek are structural factors. We propose new laws, better enforcement, procurement rules, contract bidding processes, basically efforts to decrease the opportunity to engage in corrupt or self-seeking behavior. And over the last 20 years, there's been some very remarkable progress actually across the planet. The OECD Convention in 1999, and the OECD is comprised of 35 countries that represent 2/3 of the gross product on the entire planet. And what they did prior to that, their anti-bribery convention, many businesses around the world would write off bribes paid as a business expense. It was a tax-deductible business expense. And there was a growing realization this is a terrible way to in fact run business. So it was a change of consensus that paying bribes to sell products is not good for the world economy on either end. And then, of course, on a larger scale, the UN Convention Against Corruption was enacted in 2005, and that remains. That's the only universal anti-bribery instrument that is in fact binding, and that's been ratified by something like 95% of member states of the UN, which requires individual states to criminalize bribery. It goes beyond bribery to talk about whistleblowing protections and all kinds of things. So my point is that these structural factors are important, and there's been significant progress both in individual countries and around the world in creating structural factors to make self-seeking and corrupt behavior more difficult. But of course, the problem remains, we still have a good deal of corruption going on. And what we talk about less often is corrupt people versus corrupt environments. The structural factors down here are trying to affect the corrupt environment. We talk much less about, well, the corrupt people. That is, there are people who are motivated to circumventing whatever rule or barrier that you happen to put forward. So what we have some people, unethical people in positions of authority around the world, people engaging in self-seeking behavior, people without personal accountability. So the point is, structural factors are important, but they don't solve the problem of people motivated towards self-seeking behavior. And that completes the circle. And that is, and my argument is, structural barriers aren't enough. We also need fewer unethical, incorruptible people. And how do you do that? Well, where do you get your ethics from? Where do you get your intolerance for corruption from? Is it taught in schools? Is it emphasized culturally? Is there ethics training and reinforcement? And what is the role of civil society and particularly faith-based organizations who are focused on issues of corrupt and ethical behavior? So the point is, until you have people who are less motivated to engage in corruption, you will always have people going over or under structural barriers unless you have people more disposed to selfless behavior rather than selfish behavior. So for me, there are simply 4 premises to consider for our panel and for the audience. And that is, corrupt people will exploit both corrupt and non-corrupt environments. That is, if you have people who are continuously self-seeking, structural barriers aren't enough. So we need something more than structural change to address the number of motivated actors there are to engage in selfish and unprincipled behavior. A way to do that, maybe the only way to do that, is through ethics education, training, reinforcement, improving the ethical culture so there are more principled decisions are being made. So when decisions are made in public life or private life, you move from a selfish to a selfless model, from people who are self-seeking to more people who are altruistic in their thinking, others-oriented thinking. And it seems the point 4 here is that civil society, including faith-based organizations, NGOs, academia, the private sector, they can be the source for change, especially when government corruption is rampant and popular culture emphasizes self versus others. And the self versus others is the important emphasis here. And on the bottom, I just have a little clip from a Gallup survey last year that something about easily corrupted people, selfish thinking isn't something that I made up. There are in fact surveys that show that people see this in general in places around the world. So to summarize, if we see the 4 steps here, my first point, if you have corrupt people will exploit their opportunities. So structural change is important. And I'm a very big supporter of especially these international agreements to reduce opportunities for corruption. But we need something beyond that. And that's what I'm arguing today, something beyond structural change. Ethics, education, training, reinforcement can play a major role in developing more principled decisions across societies. And I think the source of these can be civil society, mainly because I see this is where the push for this kind of change, the cultural change that I think we need to support structural change beyond creating barriers, but creating, moving toward more altruistic thinking by more people in more societies. And I'll leave it to our panel to discuss ways this kind of change might occur. And I look forward to the questions from the audience. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Excellent entree into our wider discussion. I like the way you laid it out in the kind of the complementarity between addressing structural issues or systemic issues with also addressing, another way of putting it is moral agency and how we cultivate moral development in individuals. Maybe just a quick follow-up. You work in a university setting, and I did some teaching at the university level. A lot of ethics courses, for example, were about different ways of looking at capital punishment or abortion or any number of issues, and kind of developing critical thinking about those issues. How do you see the work of higher ed today in the United States? Is it helpful in kind of moving in the direction that you're proposing?
Yes, it is, although too often ethics is taught as an academic subject rather than as a way of life. And my students are prone to, play games among the different schools of ethical thought to try to rationalize behavioral directions they wish to go. And I think that ethics education at any level is important. To me, the most important thing is recognizing an ethical decision when you get one. Recently, when I was at the store, and the very young cashier gave me incorrect change, gave me like $20 too much change. I appreciated it because to me, it's an opportunity to make an ethical decision. And of course, when I ask my students, well, what should I have done? It's shocking. People will say, oh, the store charges too much anyway. It was her fault. It was all, rationalizations for the fact that, well, the extra change was not mine. The money was not mine. So the point is, too often, education does not include ethics at all. It's very possible to get university degrees in many places, if not most, without any exposure to ethics at all. So exposure to ethical thinking. We require thinking about things like research methods in every subject. And to me, ethics is just like research methods. It's teaching people how to think in a principled way and to recognize a moral dilemma when they see one and give them principles for resolving it. And so I think, education clearly is important, but I think we require, you know, a wider swath of that kind of thinking across society.
Well, thank you. We'll move on from that, but you really laid the foundation, I think, for a very important discussion. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Wendy O'Brien. She's a legal officer at UN Office of Drugs and Crime and specializes in the area of violence against children. She's been involved with the coalition, particularly she was with us very productively during the American Society of Criminology meeting in San Francisco, where we had concurrently an important meeting at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and we were very happy that she joined us there and gave a very important presentation there. So I now turn to Dr. Wendy O'Brien.
Thanks very much, Tom, and I'm very pleased to be with good friends and colleagues from around the world for this discussion, which is such an important one, I think. And in the time that I have, I'd like to briefly journey through the legal and criminal justice fields, reflecting on some of the pressing challenges there, including those that impact on questions of trust in the law and the relevance of the law, as a way of then thinking about how we might best harness the potential for ethics, education, and good governance in preventing crime. So in legal scholarship, we worry over something that's called the implementation gap. And this highlights the distinction between law in the books and law in action. So we can talk about this with respect to international law, for example, noting that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has achieved near universal ratification, yet daily children around the world suffer abuse and violence in clear contravention of their rights. So while a great deal of good work is being done to uphold children's rights, we are clearly failing to uphold children's rights across many domains. At the national level, we observe that even though we may have comprehensive protections in law, in statute, there may be a range of ways in which individuals can miss out on the full protections that are envisaged by law. So in many places, justice is not equal. There may be discriminatory law, discriminatory procedure, harmful stereotypes. These all can play a role in marginalising individuals on the grounds of race, sex, sexual orientation, class, caste, age, ability, religious or political beliefs, among others. So what does this mean in practice then for those that are seeking access to justice? And also this question that I raised at the beginning about trust in the law. In some jurisdictions, a woman or a child cannot report an assault, including a sexual assault, to the police without a male guardian, which of course means that many crimes go unreported and unpunished. In most jurisdictions, a transgender person who is a victim of an assault will fear reporting to police lest they endure additional and perhaps more brutal violence at the hands of police. Again, in too many parts of the world, children are forced to live on the street due to abuse and poverty, and there they face risks of criminalisation for everyday acts of survival, sometimes simply for being present in the street. So these brief scenarios are just a glimpse of the challenges that sit at the heart of this question about crime, abuse of power, and the erosion of trust in the law and in criminal justice institutions. So with that in mind, one of the points that I'd like to make in this presentation is that genuine efforts to promote ethics, education, and good governance must start, in my view, with an unflinching analysis of the inequalities and structural injustices of everyday life for so many. We urgently need to redress the contexts of entrenched hardship and discrimination that create and perpetuate the tensions in our communities. These tensions that alienate individuals and families and largely exclude them from the protective functions of education and the rule of law. So the Sustainable Development Agenda offers a comprehensive framework for considering just how central these interconnected questions of social justice and equality are to our shared commitment for the creation of peaceful, sustainable, ethical communities. I will not have time to look at the Sustainable Development Agenda in detail, but I will make a couple of brief points. It is clear that the achievement of SDGs 1 and 2, for example, to end hunger and to end poverty, are absolutely necessary to create the conditions whereby learning can occur. In the context of the COVID pandemic, we know, for example, that school closures and homeschooling arrangements have had a disproportionate effect on children already living in hardship. In August of this year, UNICEF reported that at least a third of the world's school children, 463 million children globally, were unable to access remote learning. Children from the poorest households and those in remote areas are hardest hit. And there's concern that many of these children will not return to formal education. So this provides a very important contemporary context for us to be discussing education, ethics, and the rule of law. We might also think about SDG 5, gender equality, and the elimination of all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls. UN Women has carefully documented the impacts that the COVID pandemic has wrought on women as frontline workers in essential roles and in care roles, and as victims of gender-based violence in the home. The pandemic has imposed additional barriers for women seeking justice, with curfews, reduced court lists, and the inaccessibility of women's shelters closing down vital pathways to justice and safety. So where gaps in law and service continually fail victims, perpetrators enjoy impunity. This erodes public trust in criminal justice institutions and the role that they play in upholding the rule of law. So building on what Dr. Albanese has just shared about corruption, we can observe that the realisation of SDG 16, which is to promote effective, accountable and inclusive institutions, also engages these same questions about the trust in the law and the relevance of the law in criminal justice institutions. So if we reflect once more on the barriers that women and girls face in accessing justice, just as an example, we could go in any direction with this. We recognise the importance of eliminating all forms of discrimination then within criminal justice institutions. And we come to understand that good governance is much more than simply abstaining from corruption. Rather, good governance that will ensure equal access to justice for all, as SDG 16 envisages, requires promoting equal opportunity for participation in all levels of public and economic life, including by ensuring a gender-diverse criminal justice workforce, a gender-diverse judiciary, we could go on, trained in non-discrimination, gender-based violence, gender-sensitive law, and policy and practice. I'm focusing in this particular part on gender, but this is only because this is not a 1-hour lecture, it's a 6-minute presentation. There are many other facets of this conversation. I hope we can elucidate those in discussion. In closing, perhaps I can make 3 points. In my view, it's important that we don't think about ethics, education, and crime prevention as band-aids that are applied only to problems, often too late, and in a manner that may exacerbate the underlying drivers of social exclusion and crime. Rather, redress for structural inequalities and discrimination is a prerequisite for trust in and continued relevance of education itself, of law, of criminal justice institutions and criminal justice actors. And the Sustainable Development Agenda provides us with the framework for action on this. Non-discrimination is at the heart of this work. If you were to trace through the points that I have made, discrimination is really the core problem. Faith-based organisations and community-based organisations can, and they do already, play an important role in modelling the values and the behaviours that, that promote non-discriminatory practice, that stop discrimination in its tracks. And this can also be ensuring that there is equal voice, that there is gender diversity within, for example, the faith-based organisation at all levels. And in my third and final point in closing, please allow me to share some information. I will share my screen. Share some information on some educational materials that we have developed at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime under the Education for Justice initiative. So if you have a look at the 9 tabs at the bottom, you'll see the first is integrity and ethics, anti-corruption, crime prevention and criminal justice. And we have several other themes as well, but the most relevant are at the beginning. These are educational curricula that we have developed for use by academics. They are freely available on our website. You can see the URL there. And these are to encourage academics, and we had that conversation earlier in our panel today about how relevant higher education is to engage in these questions. The intention with these materials is to encourage academics to enliven some of these questions in the classroom and to build the practical skills in the criminal justice actors, educators, doctors, lawyers of the future, so that we really can have that ethical framework in action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. O'Brien. And I think this follows very nicely from J. Albanese and brought up some important points, the gap between the law and the implementation. And you have pointed us to the structural dimensions and the inequality and the discrimination that erodes trust. And I guess maybe, and I appreciate very much what the last screen of the UNODC curricula related to education for justice. I think that's an important resource there. Maybe just a little bit of exchange on the kind of framework of structural versus, let's say, individual agency. In the curriculum of UNODC, do you see a balance there? Is it that we can't begin to discuss agency, let's say individual good behavior or moral development without first addressing, or do they are they intertwined?
They are intertwined. I mean, the materials that I have very briefly introduced here are quite complex because there are 9 themes and they are devised in a way that they will have multidisciplinary appeal. So the intention is not just that they are taught in criminal justice classrooms, but that they are also taught to our future social workers. They are taught in history classes, in gender studies classes. So they are quite modular in that sense. An academic can pick it up and they can ask the questions that they think are relevant, not only to the discipline that they're teaching, but also the context in which they are teaching. So for example, an academic teaching in Austria may interpret some of the materials differently and raise different questions about, for example, national law than an academic in Burkina Faso would do. So they are, we are envisaging that they are useful in the hands of all academics. But this question really about whether or not we're engaging that question of individual agency, yes, I think that we are. There are reflective exercises that we encourage academics to consider. So the entire series is moored to international law and the United Nations standards and norms on crime prevention and criminal justice. And then asking students in class, what is it that you could do? Look at your national practice, look at the law, look at the policy, let's look at media articles relevant to this particular issue. What strategy could you roll out to affect change here? So really empowering and trying to equip students with practical skills that will allow them to make a change. I hope that answers a little the question.
Yeah, no, I think it's very helpful, and we'll hopefully come back to some of that in our discussion. But thank you again for this very useful and important contribution. And I think for our faith-based audience that you affirmed the important role that faith actors are playing already and can even build upon. And I think the resources that you referred to in your last slide is very valuable as well. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Elmar Kuhn, a Roman Catholic theologian based in Vienna. And sir, you now have the floor.
Thanks very much. Hi, Thomas. It's for me a tremendous thing to be part of this gremium, and I thank very much to you, Dr. Wendy O'Brien, for addressing problems which are really serious problems, and they're worthwhile in our whole world. And if I remember you addressed Austria, I can assure you in Austria we have exactly the same problems because it's a problem of humanity. And I'm very happy that Thomas and Michael are organizing these wonderful webinars, because we get such a lot of expertise and information. And I think and I hope that one time we will be able to transform this into actions for a better world. So I will show you some ideas what can lead us to this. So first I will show you a slide, which is here. It's a problem we had a few days ago on Saturday in Vienna. We had a very severe street fight in the middle of Vienna between Iraqi and Syrian youth gangs, and most of them had been asylum seekers. That's a severe problem because it damages all our living together. And the problem is how to deal with it. And I think the main problem is that in the fact of such a street fight, there is absolutely no possibility for an ethical intervention. So we have to understand that laws and policy, law policy and all things of our state police are so important to get a moment cleared. But to clear a moment and to bring these youth gangs into prison is absolutely not the solution. And if I follow the last webinars we have focused a lot of ethical prison work with people who came into problems with society and now are imprisoned. And we see such a lot of possibilities to do resocialization work afterwards, to do ethical understanding, to give exercises. It's so important to do all these things, but that's only one side of our lung, and our lung of humanity has two sides. And the other side is that the failures, the problems which caused this street fight in Vienna on a single point, the failures which started years and years before with these young people. And because of this, I believe that the first thing we have to do is to see that failures which started in years and years of education before are a chance for us as faith-based organization to restart the ethical thinking in education and school. There we have a chance to show that faith is a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And that means that education and tolerance, meaning of life, the integration and participation in social and political life is something which has to start in kindergarten and schools, but at the same time in the mosques, in the temples and churches. And it is a dream from me, where one time it will not start in a mosque and besides in a temple and besides in a church, but it will start together with the world religions coming together and educate these people by an idea of which we call sometimes the golden rule, something which is present in our humanity. And we have to show this as a central necessity for our religions and for all faithful people. Well, I only wanted to show you this because that's at the bottom of the problem. We face problems targeting our life, targeting our society, targeting our peace in our societies. But if we look into schools, then we can start a program which allows us to stop these problems. And it's not only corruption, it's not only a gender problem, it's not only a problem of faith and of anything else. It's a problem of humanity. And that means to teach tolerance means at first to teach diversity, to teach an understanding that people are very different also if they're living together in one school, in one town, in one city. And as we have seen all over, the children, the young children, also Turkish and Kurdish, Iraqi and Syrian, no matter, they have absolutely no problem in playing and living together. What causes a problem is that inside of the school and education career, in their homes and the mosques and the churches, they get a bad teaching and bad role models, which turn her life into a life without tolerance and with a lot of hostility to others. That is the point in which we have to intervene. And in Vienna, we have an example for an interreligious cooperation of all religions in the education of teachers, which is, I think it's very, very important to have such a co-education because all are integrated in the same problem and learn one with the others. And to teach the teachers is one of the methods in which we can get solutions. And I myself initiated with the European Academy of Science and Arts in Vienna a master course system for interreligious competence with the participation of all major religions. But I know that's only a drop in the water. But as a faithful person, I have a belief and I have a dream. The dream that once all these drops in the water we produce may able to fill the ocean. And so if I want to have a summary, it's quite easy. It's necessary not only to be excellent in theory, but also to present good practice models, also for the needs of the United Nations. Models where cooperation and anti-corruption and gender awareness, all these things work and go into the heads of the children and form their behavior. But to present these models, we have to concentrate of our own faithful USP, our unique selling point in this interacting world. And I think the only three things in which we are really competent as faithful people and religious people are spirituality, forgiveness, and hope. And by this, we are able to teach communion, working together to be help for the helpless and voice for the voiceless. That is our task, and therefore we should work together. And I think webinars are a very good method of information, and we need this. And I estimate it really to have such high-ranking persons like today and the other webinars to hear that we have the same problems, but we have different ways of solutions, and we can learn one from the other. But together we should be able to find also ways to integrate specific project realities, what is happening down on earth, for to show how we can act in our own surrounding. Our discussions have to come down to earth, and then we would be invincible with the power of our religious communions in practice, showing that we can fight for a better humanity. And both together, interreligious theory and practice, have the power to turn the face of our earth. That is why we are here, because we believe in the ability of religions to change the face of the world. And the main step we have to do is we must expand our field of activity. Like we've heard today, it's not only a problem of crime prevention and justice, it's a problem of the whole humanity, of education, of praxis, of economy, of politics. And in all these fields, we have a message to tell. Because all this together is our general responsibility for realizing a peaceful and better society. And so our USP, our unique selling point which we have and nobody else has. We have to demand it highly in our world. The world demands it. The world needs it and wants it because they know that economics and politics alone are not able to resolve the problems which we face today. Nor politics, nor economy can create these spiritual and hopeful values. It's our time and it's our holy obligation. So it's really my hope that we will work together as we did for the last weeks and months, and that this faith-based organization will implement a system of working together and of spending hope to a hopeless world. So this wonderful coalition is able to form a better world in religious freedom and cooperation. And if we are not able to do this, then we should abolish all religion. So please, let's work together and bring the things to ground, and bring it to ground in the United States, in Australia, in Austria, and in the People's Republic of Congo. Because I think everywhere there are people, human people, which are worthwhile to work for them, that they will have a better life in freedom and in tranquility. That's our task, and I'm very pleased to be part of this. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Elmar Kuhn, and underscoring the importance of religion, of spirituality, of faith-based organizations. And in some ways, religion is also evaluated by its own performance in the areas of ethics and corruption or that. And one of the challenges religion has always faced is that its internal arguments between the religions, and even sometimes more acrimoniously within religions, has served to delegitimize religion as really a contributor to solutions because of so much disunity, mutual demonization that has gone on. But that has changed dramatically. There are many more interfaith organizations that are doing great work, and I like your concept of developing interreligious capacities, or that education does teach about the religions in a non-evangelical way, but in a respectful way that you would teach about art or art history or great literature, the humanities, and understand the importance of religion. I wonder if you'd say just a bit about your knowledge about in Austria. Is religion taught in schools, in, I guess, what in America we call public schools, or is that left to the individual family and the local religious communities to be the instructors of religious values?
I think we are very privileged in Austria and also in Germany, because we have this system of religious instructions inside the schools through all years, done by the religious instructors of every religion, so that Catholics are in a Catholic lesson, and Protestants in a Protestant, and Muslims in a Muslim with an imam. That's quite useful, but I fear that by this we lose the idea that we are all coming together. And I think religious instruction in school can be very helpful, but maybe it should be organized more in an working together and showing the strength of every religion to the pupils, because they shouldn't get an impression that their religion is better than the other religion. They should get the impression that their religion is the basis on which they can live, but they have to make a cooperation in tolerance and in wide openness of the mind for all the others, because we have to live together, and we shouldn't separate. We should bring together. And I think it's only in Germany and in Austria that we have this system in schools. And well, let's see if we can do something positive with it. But our new world, with all this mixing of cultures and religions, needs more expertise in coming together and understanding the other. And from the Catholic religious instructions, I know that we try to bring in this understanding, and that's the reason why the Catholic Church started this system of interreligious work for the preparation of the teachers. That's the church seminary, but we integrated the other Christian churches, we integrated the Jewish, we integrated the Muslims, and everybody is welcome, and they all have the possibility to teach their teachers, and at the same time to teach diversity and tolerance one to the other, because they're working together in this education system. I think this could be one of the goals we can achieve, but it's a long way, and the best thing is when we start today.
Well, I think there's been some progress made, and I think of I think it was the term Madeleine Albright, a former Secretary of State in the United States, talking about religious literacy, that we need to upgrade that. And when you spoke about the Golden Rule, I was reminded of an effort that the Catholic theologian Hans Kung and others promoted, the idea of how we can create a global ethics. But let's move on to our final, last but not least, panelist, the Reverend Darcy Roque. She is the pastor of the Community Church Unitarian Universalist in New Orleans in the United States, a place that is often undergoing storms and from the Gulf and hurricanes. And I think fortunately she can be with us today because the recent hurricane has passed. So Reverend Roque, we look forward to hearing from you now. Welcome.
Thanks so very much. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to be with such esteemed panelists. And I think some of what I'm going to be talking about really comes together with all that we've said today, touching on some of the UN Millennium Development Goals of gender equality, combating HIV/AIDS, maternal health, speaking about the role of religion as a lived reality, as Pastor Kuhn discussed. So I'm going to be talking actually very much about a specific program today, because for me, ethics at its core is about, of course, the lived experience of individuals. So religions can help create moral foundations from which to make decisions within that lived experience. So my religious tradition, the Unitarian Universalist Church, affirms the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Religions across the world, in general terms, speak of equity and justice. However, as has been kind of lifted up, in practice, traditions, including my own, at times can create rules and ethical rules that dehumanize, supporting and promoting racist, homophobic, or misogynistic structures that go against this ethics of care, justice, and equity. So as a minister, as a religious person, I actually take seriously then the responsibility to create positive cultural change, particularly around issues that are rooted in a religiosity of patriarchy and shaming. So today I'm actually going to be focusing on a program that has been created by the Unitarian Universalist Church and the United Church of Christ called Our Whole Lives, which is a comprehensive, scientifically accurate, developmentally appropriate sexual education program with programs for 5 to 6-year-olds all the way up to seniors over 60, recognizing that sexual health and our sexual lives are throughout our lives. So for context, I live in a state, Louisiana, that has some of the highest HIV/AIDS and STI rates in America. And yet my state upholds, and states around me uphold and guard an abstinence-only education program, which is policy supported and promoted by evangelical Christian politicians and religious leaders. Many of you may have heard about the recent sex scandal and resignation of the president of the Christian conservative college, Liberty University, Jerry Falwell Jr. Feminist theologian and Disciples of Christ minister, Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock, put it best when she wrote of the scandal and of the attendant religious values that have become the ethics of a certain type of Christian conservatism, a certain type. Why, we might ask, did his Falwell's departure take so long? Why was it kinky sex that took him down when he risked lives to reopen the university in the midst of a pandemic, offended Black alumni with his creation of a blackface face mask, and made a mockery of Christian ethics with his support for a thrice married president who boasts of sexually predatory behavior? Because Falwell's worst offenses didn't violate core fundamentalist principles that define Liberty University's understanding of the Bible: disbelief of science, racism, and male domination of women, the trifecta on which they've bet their future. So this is the type of religious conservatism which lead progressive religious traditions, actually truly all religious traditions, should not only resist, but take responsibility to create alternatives, or truly actually bring us back to the real religious fundamentals of equity and care. And so, for example, Our Whole Lives, which is actually taught from everywhere from faith communities to schools to correctional facilities, has a secular foundation with additional religious components, but it's far from value-free. The program gives clear messages about the following key sexuality issues: self-worth, sexual health, responsibility, and justice and inclusivity. Our Whole Lives also recognizes and respects the diversity of participants with respect to biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and disability status. The activities and language that are used throughout the program have been carefully chosen to be inclusive as possible of this human diversity. Thus, OWL creates an inclusive foundation for both individual decision-making rooted in one's value system, as well as tools to actually make a positive change in the larger culture. So I'm just going to use a few brief examples from my teaching, promotion, and having a child, a 5-year-old, actually in the Our Whole Lives program. So first, my son has taken the kindergarten first grade OWL. And in that time, he learned the correct naming of his body parts, an ability that is proven to help stop sexual assault or slow it down. If children can name their correct body parts, they are able to better recognize if something inappropriate is being done to them. My son has also learned about consent in a developmentally appropriate way. So for example, he learned that if I push or hug you and you say no, it is my responsibility to stop. Conversely, if someone is doing something we do not want, we each have the right to say no to something being done to our bodies. While initially it seems like a simple lesson, it of course provides a foundation for later learnings. According to the United Nations study of ending violence against women, it's estimated that 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner. And that's not including sexual harassment at some point in their lives. Some studies show up to 70%. So this speaks to a culture of, as Dr. Brock wrote, male domination of women, where another person's body is property. This is learned behavior, supported by some religious cultures. Thus, we religious institutions can and should take responsibility to help create better foundations. A 6-year-old who learns to stop when asked to stop by his peers, particularly female peers, will hopefully take these lessons solidified over time into not only his sexual life, but his relating in life and work. However, a person who learns that other people are to be dominated, whether in sexual situations or in any number of ways, will also take those lessons into life and work. So finally, as part of my ministry, I also work with the NGO Louisiana Public Health Institute around sexual education. And I recently helped facilitate a virtual brunch where teenage girls spoke of their experience or lack thereof of sexuality education. While I don't want to go into any specifics, I was amazed by these young women's intelligence, depth, and honesty. While some girls defined themselves as religious, others did not. However, they all saw sexual education as helping provide a foundation of learning and information for which they could then, with their value systems, make informed decisions. And they noted, of course, that they will learn this information, particularly with the internet, in one way or another. The question is, are they getting accurate information, and have we helped facilitate a moral framework that supports best decision making? As we consider more collaborative relationships between the United Nations, NGOs, and religious institutions, we religious leaders, while calling for change from secular society, must also recognize the change that we must help create within our churches, synagogues, sanghas, and mosques. We must be more welcoming of a variety of sexual and gender identities. We must meet young people where they're at. Only then can we help connect their values to their religious lives, to ethics. We must not only teach, but support the leadership of young people so that they may move forward the values that truly lay the groundwork for the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights: justice, inclusivity, and equity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Darcy Roque, and giving us a good example of ethics and education in practice rooted in the faith-based organization. Just a couple of follow-up. Is there a theological dimension to the education that you've described, this model of education? And maybe related to it is, how would you kind of fit what you've described as a best practice into Jay Albanese's framework, where he's kind of creating this complementarity of sorts between the structural factors and the individual moral decision factor?
Well, absolutely. And, this was a collaboration, which I think speaks to intercollaboration between religious traditions, between the United Church of Christ and Unitarian Universalism. So I don't want to speak for the United Church of Christ in this moment, but for Unitarian Universalism, the idea of, as I mentioned, the inherent worth and dignity, and one can look at it in another tradition, the sacred understanding of our bodies, of our God-given bodies. And too much, especially in Western religious traditions, we have this idea of the separation of the mind and body. And for that, I think, has created those cultures of shaming and patriarchy, instead of understanding that all parts of us are God-given and sacred, and to think about that holistically, instead of sort of spirituality is almost no longer embodied. And then if we're talking about working with the United Nations, that has to be about, and we're talking about things like sexual assault, we're talking about things like, poverty. Those are all embodied experiences. So I think of my understanding as a theologian and a religious person is, how do we bring our bodies back into our discussions of our faithful lives? Because too often they're separated, and too often they're shamed. And so I think that's really important, because also in terms of ethics, if you don't see a person in their fullness and their embodiment, and so, I noticed trans folks were mentioned too often when individuals are rejected from their religious systems, from those value systems. One, there's a deep hypocrisy there, but two, there becomes a norming of what is a normal body, which is, of course, in my opinion, God creates individuals as they are meant to be. And so in coming to understanding of oneself, especially younger people who I think have a more inclusive understanding of sexual and gender identities, if we truly want to relate and connect with young people, for example, the younger leaders who are going to be moving this work forward, we have to, as religious institutions, come to a point where we have become more open and affirming to their understandings in the world. And so that's one way that I see that. And then in terms of kind of Dr. Albanese's understanding of ethics, I relate to much of it, and I think we are on the same page. I also think there is such culture that has been created, and it's not going to change in our entire lifetimes, but it has been long there, and religion has played a part in it, as I mentioned, of patriarchy. And so I think there needs to be that balance of individual decision-making as well as culture change. So I'm going to use a COVID example. Here in the United States, we have individuals that are coming back from college who are coming back to the dorms in colleges right now. And COVID is spreading pretty wildly. Now, deans of colleges are upset because young people, 19, 20-year-olds, are having parties where they are not masked and they are spreading COVID when they're not supposed to. The rules tell them not to. Now, there will be certain folks who are individual decision makers who will make the right choice, no matter what kind of leadership says. However, there's also a culture created, I'm just going to say it, by our larger administration, but also by colleges who have chosen to open, to have in-person classes. That culture of leadership then downplays COVID. And so the culture for the students then becomes one where that is allowed more. Now, of course, the individual decision-making should be making better decisions. And the larger culture is affirming making irresponsible decisions. And so I think there's just that balance. And I think about that in any number of ways that we do education as well.
Well, thank you very much again, indeed. And I'm now on that foundation, and having heard from all of these very, very stimulating presentations, we'll open it up to a gallery mode for the panelists. And I'd also like to invite in Dr. Michael Plotzer to join this discussion at this juncture, that we can have a little bit of engagement among the panelists. So it's an opportunity for each others of us to ask a question or underscore something that was said or seek clarification among the panelists. So that opportunity is now opened up to the entire group of panelists.
Well, I see a quick.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say I can answer a quick question. I see a quick question from Pierre Beauregard about sexual education model addressing pornography and its harm on developing appropriate, effective relationships. And you think parents need support in discussion sexuality and pornography in age-appropriate ways? Yes, and yes, absolutely. If I might just quickly answer. Our Whole Lives program does address that. And also in the discussion with teenagers that I had just recently, that was something that came up often, is that often exposures for young people, their first exposure to sexuality education is pornography online, which of course is also creating unrealistic expectations, any number of issues. And so there's a recognition of that. And so that is why it starts at K through 1. And we don't talk about, we make it developmentally appropriate. So we're not talking about, we talk about the ways, certain ideas of sexuality, but not sex to that degree until a little later. But we provide a foundation to start the conversations that parents can have. Because one of the parts about Our Whole Lives, which answers Mr. Beauregard's second question, which is that parents are the primary sexuality educators. They are value systems, because that's the household that children are living in. So our idea is to help support their sexuality education by first providing the information and then having the conversation, bringing those conversations home. And that can be hard for parents. I'm a parent myself. We thought I was very open to talking about it. Now I'm like, oh boy, we're doing that work. But that is a real need, and it is interesting that a church has filled that need in our state. But I think that idea of also making it not such a taboo topic then allows it to be talked about more openly, and isn't something that people are going to find initially online. But yes, if the education aspect is not there, then young people generally learn about it from their peers or online. And that information, we don't know where they're getting the information, so there's no. Yeah.
Michael, you had your hand up. Thank you, Darcy.
Well, you had asked me to say something, and those who know me, I tend to be the provocateur. I mean, I ask the questions no one else asks. Wendy, you pointed out that we have implementation gaps almost everywhere. Darcy, you spoke forthrightly about the religious community having deficiencies. I wonder, Wendy, can the UN really point fingers? Can we analyze the deficiencies of member states and publish and discuss them openly? Can you answer that question?
Thank you for the provocative question. You know, I framed the statement about the implementation gap. I said in legal scholarship, we are interested in this question. So in that moment, I'm wearing my hat as an academic. I'm adjunct associate professor at Deakin University in Australia. And, you know, I write on topics like this. You know, I'm looking particularly at, you know, the extent to which children's rights are upheld. But there are a couple of things that I can say, I think, that cut across both the fields of work. And that is that it's actually very difficult. I think, you know, there are very many structural impediments to the full realization of human rights everywhere at all times. But I think that what we need to do is reflect on the fact that human rights are communitarian values that we have agreed on as a people. We have come together internationally, globally, and said, this is what matters to us. Protecting children from violence, for example, matters to us. Ensuring that they have the right to education, etc. On and on we could go. That doesn't mean, though, that there's an automatic implementation of that right. So there is a wealth of scholarship on this and what the mechanisms are for that. But I think that the UN is a very necessary institution for progressing this work in its constant dialogue with member states about the extent of the challenges they face, and in asking and answering questions about ways in which the UN can support the efforts of member states to better uphold the rights of their citizens. And you know, this can be very practical guidance, you know, looking at the law within a particular state and saying, are there ways in which we could strengthen the protections around this particular sphere of criminal law, for example? Are there ways in which we could deliver training to criminal justice actors to assist in the capacity building that would help criminal justice actors to better uphold the rights of individuals that are really quite vulnerable when they come into contact with the criminal justice system, whether they are held in police stations, whether they are stopped and searched on the street, whether they are indeed sentenced to a period of deprivation of liberty and incarcerated. Individuals are made vulnerable in those moments. And so we do have, at international law, standards and norms that guide member states in their actions around that. But that doesn't mean, I mean, you know, this sort of takes us now into the territory that Jay was talking about. You know, 100 individual decisions have to be made to make sure that the rights of that one prisoner are upheld. It doesn't, you know, it's a complex sort of machine, I think. And this is why I think that we need to be working across multiple domains. So there's been a lot of emphasis on education in our panel today, which I think is absolutely right. There's also been quite a lot of talk about starting very early with kids, kindergarten and so on. And I did want to just say that the Education for Justice initiative at UNODC does also have components that provide materials for very young children. There's an animated series called The Zorbs. There's materials there for primary school students and also for secondary students. So interested people can have a look at the link that I have sent and navigate from there to those materials as well. But I think that education is a part of it. But I think that perhaps the point that I was hoping to make in my remarks was that we need to be very careful about models of individual responsibilization, sort of looking at an individual and saying, you have breached this ethical code, you have breached the law. The full force of the law will, you know, you will feel the full force of the law. The bad apples theory, we would talk about it in criminology. it's not, it's a theory that has been debunked in so much as, you know, we can remove all of the bad apples and there will still be bad apples. It's this balancing of individual decisions and also looking at the structural factors that are contributing to the culture. I think that the example that Reverend Oakes gave on COVID is a very cogent one, you know, that it's really this combination of things. Individuals make decisions within a structure, within an environment. So for my part, I'm concerned about the individuals that have very constrained decision-making capabilities. So a child, for example, that is too hungry to learn, we are doing the wrong thing by that child. We are failing that child if we criminalize him at the age of 10 for having breached the law. This is a child that's trying to survive. And we have a structural injustice at play. So I think that we need to, you know, put down our blunt tools and start to use a more sophisticated analysis in understanding what it is that we've got that's going wrong here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jay, you listened to some wonderful presentations. Are you going to throw out your theory and start anew, or you feel somewhat corroborative support?
Yes, I'd like to reemphasize, as I think others have, is that ultimately all these decisions, starting with the world's largest problems down, you know, are the result of decision-making that is lacking. It's either poor or selfish or corrupt, whatever it is. So for me, the overriding thing that I take away is that, you know, one, you know, ethics provides the way to see that there's greater purpose in life than self-interest. And I think for a shocking number of people on the planet, they don't understand that basic premise. And secondly, is that, you know, we are all, you know, moral agents. We have moral responsibilities, and there's methods to, you know, evaluate and defend our positions on moral questions. And I think there's just a vacuum there that lies in the educational process, and before that within families. And I think schools, faith-based organizations, and others, you know, can really chime in. One other quick thing. There's been research that has shown pretty conclusively that individuals often overestimate their own ethicality of their own behavior. And we see this with a lot of otherwise well-educated people in positions of power who have been taken down in recent years for some, you know, horrible instances of misconduct. And, you know, there's a lot of people who you would think would know better, don't. They don't recognize, you know, their own underlying self-serving biases that promote misconduct. We tend to see ourselves as rational, ethical, you know, we're competent, we're objective, but this, you know, ethical blind spot that many people have when it comes to their own behavior creates, you know, the conflict of interests, the underlying biases, and the rationalizations for bad individual decision-making. So I see if we can increase the proportion, there will always be bad behavior. Ethics will never go out of business, but I think it's an important responsibility to raise the bar. So among the pool of people making decisions, there's a higher proportion of people making principled decisions in, and not, you know, selfish decisions.
Maybe I can jump to a couple of questions that have come in from the audience that have been sent into our email. One is about the situation in the United States and the need for criminal justice reform. And I assume this applies in not only the United States, but how might we think of the relevance of our discussion to criminal justice reform? Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, one quick statement.
That's from Matthew Goldberg in Maryland in the USA.
Sure. You know, so whether you're talking about misconduct, whether it's, let's say, false testimony by police or prosecutorial misconduct and wrongful convictions or asset seizure, things like that, commercial bribery, The essence of corruption, lies at the feet of the people making these decisions. So you do need structural things which require rules, regulations, and oversight of these decisions, which is lacking in almost every one of these cases. But on the other end, as Elmar emphasized, you need prevention. That is, well, what is the screening of people for those positions? What kind of training are they getting? In-service training for police in the US is not where it needs to be. All these kinds of things to teach the principles, but continually reinforce them so people don't become cynical and start regarding their own interests above those of others.
Yeah, if I might just add too, I think something that has been coming up over the last few years, but certainly this year, is the Black Lives Matter movement, which came out of 2013, created by 3 Black women who were talking about police brutality towards people of color, particularly Black people. And I think an important part, and we're still not completely there, and this is where faith communities, I think, can play a part in it, is quite honestly more white people are kind of, in the United States, are actually recognizing the reality of that, instead of pretending that is something that doesn't exist, that there's just fairness and justice and equity in these systems. And so part of that work is supporting that movement and the reality of that, and the ways in which holding police, the entire culture, accountable. And so there are very live discussions around what that means as a whole for a system. That yes, there are, that the whole bad apple theory, as Dr. O'Brien was talking about, they're really finding that is not, the structure itself and the way it's been continually structured for the last few years at its core has systematic abuse in criminal justice. And so they're looking at a number of ways. One, police, but also bail systems in which states get money through charging bail for people who are incarcerated, any number of criminal justice issues. And that's actually a very live in New Orleans. There are quite a few faith leaders who are working very deeply in that work. I almost think of one of our panelists from 2 panels ago or 1 panel ago, Sister Allison McCrary, who does a lot of work around that. So that's just to say that, yes, that's a very, I think a very live issue, and also something that religious folk are getting more and more involved in.
Wendy, did you want to add?
If you don't mind, I'd like to add. I mean, I agree with the views that have been shared very much. But I'm also wanting to say that I think sometimes we are unrealistic in our expectations of individuals within particular professional sectors, that they are somehow immune to the broader narratives that circulate in culture. They are also inculcated from a very young age to believe that, if they're a man, then they're superior. If they're white, then they're superior. So these cultures of misogyny and racism, I think, are deeply entrenched across our cultures. And I think that if we really want to root those out, we need to take a global, holistic approach, rather than to say, all right, prison officials, you're really, on the radar now, and we're going to really monitor. I mean, it's very important that there are minimum standards. It is very important that there are monitoring mechanisms in prison. We have many safeguards in place. These are hugely important, particularly because of the vulnerability of the people that find themselves in those situations, as I mentioned before. But I think that we are kidding ourselves if we say that, well, the problem lies there. And so we can sit in our lounge rooms and watch the evening news and there's an incidence of, police brutality, and we say, well, that's a terrible thing. But these things are going on in our school grounds as well, because we are providing conflicting messages to people about what matters, about what power is, about how you can get it. And I think that it really is, I think it was perhaps Jay that mentioned earlier about, self and other. And I think that this, I think we're also at a really interesting moment in terms of COVID too. The atomization of our culture as we each spend more time by ourselves, and perhaps, you know, our outlet is to promote ourselves further on social media or whatever it might be, I feel like we might find ourselves distanced further from these communitarian values that remind us what binds us. I think that we don't spend enough time focusing on that. We focus on what separates us. You know, you're a man and I am a woman. This is, you know, this is black and this is white. I am rich and you are poor, or whatever the arbitrary binary divisions are that we set up between ourselves. These are inherently divisive, and I think they need to be torn down wherever they emerge. And this is where I think there's so much value in the work that faith-based organizations do. And particularly, I think, in the coalition where, you know, this is a coming together in diversity. This is a really beautiful thing. So I celebrate that, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of it.
I am running out of time. We're running out of time. So I'm going to take the prerogative. Wendy, that was your kind of final statement, and I'll let the others take 1 minute or less to share a bit. I'll go next to Reverend Roque, then to Dr. Kuhn, and to Dr. J. Albanese, and then I'm going to invite Michael Plotzer to tell us about what's in store in the future. So, Reverend Roque, your final word. And I think try to, just as I think Wendy did, you know, our audience, many of them are faith-based leaders, maybe just some counsel to them of how this applies and what you might recommend. But you don't have to speak to that, but you might add a word on that.
Tall order there. No, I am. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that Dr. O'Brien really put some important aspects in what we're talking about here, and Pastor Kuhn and Dr. Albanese have put really some amazing points together. And I think, you know, so much of faith community also comes to dialogue. And it sounds cliche, it sounds like we're coming back to the basics, but that is a huge part of it, is that how do we actually have these conversations and have disagreements and have understandings in constructive ways, knowing that, again, we are never going to hit some ideal, but we can continue the work of dialogue and coming to a place. And that's what I've really loved about the work that we're doing here, is actually talking about how does the United Nations and faith-based organizations begin to dialogue more. And in that dialogue, how are both changed in positive ways? And so that's, I think, a major part about what we were talking about today, is that dialogue, and that we have some different perspectives, but actually overall we have some shared goals. And so how do we honor actually our own values while also understanding we're in a community space, a civic space, where we will be able to have the foundation of our values while also moving in directions and growing in directions so that we can actually work together on a global stage.
Very good. Thank you. Dr. Kuhn?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Really, I learned a lot in this discussion today. And for me, it's important to see that we have to emphasize more to the family education and to education of parents, because they are the first teachers of ethics. And we have to learn to go into kindergartens and to give more knowledge and more empowerment in these parts of the lives, the first 5 years. But at the same time, I'm absolutely sure we have to dare to influence politics. And Madeleine Albright told us that religion is a political part of our society. I think both things we have to bring in together. And so I'm looking forward not only to talk with you and to hear what you're telling and to learn from you, but I'm looking forward to meet you, because by meeting we can discuss more profound and more deeply, and we see how things are going in reality. I think after COVID-19, we will have to relearn to understand the circumstances in which we all live, and to learn from the circumstances and from the realities in which we live. And so I think COVID-19 is a big challenge, but it gives us also the knowledge and the emphasis to see video is not all. We are living persons, and we need to discuss face to face, and then we are able to learn and to go the next steps. And I think after COVID-19, I think we will have both things: the real meetings and the higher level expertise in such webinars. Thanks so much for organizing this.
Well, thank you. And we accept your invitation when we come to Vienna. We'll meet together and have some nice coffee and cake. Apple strudel is put my order in.
And Sachertorte.
Okay. Dr. Albanese.
Yeah, just to wrap up, I think, especially from the perspective of the faith-based organizations and the educators, too often, the world's problems are big. I mean, there's conflict and there's injustice and there's inequality, and people tend to think that they're being pushed down from the top. And for me, it's very important and empowering for people to say, well, no, all these decisions are pushed from the bottom up. And every decision that you make has an impact on how other people treat themselves, from common courtesies in retail transactions all the way up. And that, it's individuals making decisions to do things that are either helpful to others or that are altruistic or that are not self-focused, I think is the basis for ethics. It's the basis for every religious tradition. And I think it's empowering if we can help turn that around so individuals don't see the world's problems crushing down on them, but how individuals help to push up on all these problems, because all these problems were created from the bottom up. And just to see the world a little bit differently and the power of individual volition, in changing that process.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists. I think to the audience and to those who submitted questions that we didn't get to. I see from Sheikh Ramzi in the UK, Mitchell Gold and Walter Murph and many others. I apologize that we couldn't cover them all. But I'd like to now turn things over to Michael Plotzer, who's together we are the co-chairs of the coalition, and he will tell us a little bit about some exciting upcoming events. Dr. Plotzer.
Okay, quickly, because I know we're over time. On October 5, you should tune in again to the same channel here. We're going to be talking about restorative justice, using the golden rule, mercy, to try to reach some kind of compromise between victim and the criminal, the sacraments of reconciliation, basically. October 15 is when I think we're finishing our year. We will have because it's the Conference of State Parties Against Organized Crime, we will have a seminar at the Sigmund Freud University on how organized crime affects communities, the social effect of criminal behavior, as Jay pointed out just now. And in the evening, we will have a very high-level event again at the Sigmund Freud University, a hybrid event, so everyone can tune in virtually, on how FBOs can combat organized crime and corruption. So we again take our place in the sun and explain how we are important and useful to the criminal justice community. So I hope that you all tune in for these 3 events. We'll see what happens after that, but we're going to finish with a big finale with the Minister of Justice of Austria and the ED of the UNODC, and hopefully the Cardinal as well from the Vienna Cathedral. Okay?
Yes, I mean, I applaud the great work that you're doing, especially preparing that October meeting of the Conference of the Parties and UNODC. This concludes. Please look at our website, coalitionfbo.org, and also this webinar will be posted on YouTube. Usually it takes us a day or so to edit it and make sure that pauses or things that weren't exactly right, and not the content, but if there were glitches or I didn't turn on my mute or something, we kind of take those out so that we don't lose the interest of the audience. But with that, we'll conclude, and thanks all around. Well-deserved, great session, great panel, great discussion. And I think I see that our audience stayed with us to the very end. So thank you all. Well done. Until next time.
Thanks so much.